Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer. My co-host is Holly Kane, and together we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We're so glad you're here with us. Welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am here today with my co-host, Holly Kane. Holly, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing okay, but I've been sick, so my voice might sound a little bit hoarse today. So I apologize to anyone if that drives you crazy, but
Yeah, I think it sounds okay, and hopefully we'll get through without too much coughing.
okay, good. I know where my mute button is, so
Yes.
I won't subject you guys to that. So before we jump into today's episode, though, we have something fun to share about the podcast.
Yes, we do, Holly. So we are excited to share with you guys that we have recently hit 10,000 downloads of the podcast, which is super amazing. And we just want to take a moment to thank each of you who has been listening, who's been sharing the podcast. If you have subscribed to the podcast, we are so grateful for you, and for everybody that has taken time to give us feedback, either on a review on Apple Podcasts or through, social media, through our Facebook group. We just really appreciate every single person who's been a part of the podcast so far. So,
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
yes. So we have been going through a series about healthy relationships, and the goal has been to support you in your leadership and really to be able to help you develop and nurture healthy relationships. Because as we talked about in the first episode of this series, which was episode 15, we talked about the fact that leadership is all about relationships. So it's so important for us to be able to have healthy relationships in order to have healthy leadership. So we've had some really great conversations with other women about various ways to improve our relationships. But we also know that there are times that relationships are just plain hard. There isn't always an easy answer, and sometimes you might be doing all the right things in your relationships and nothing seems to change. And it can just be a really sometimes dark and lonely place when you're experiencing that. So we wanted to address 3 of the situations that you might be dealing with and offer some encouragement for you if that's where you're at. And we asked in our Purposeful Leadership Facebook group for people to vote on the topics that they would be most interested in us talking about. So these were the top 3. So we're going to talk about what to do when you've been hurt. We're going to talk about when marriage is hard. And then we're also going to chat about what to do when you disagree with the leadership that you are under, or that the leadership that's over you. We're going to give you some thoughts about how to deal with these various difficult relationships. And a lot of what we'll share could be applied to all kinds of different circumstances. But we're hoping to give you some things that will be, just encouragement, but also some action steps that you can take to deal with the times when relationships are hard. And we're also probably going to talk about some of the episodes that we've had so far in this series, because a lot of our guests have shared some really, really helpful tips along the way. And so we'll probably refer to some of that as well. So Holly, you want to get us started with the first situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk about when you've been hurt. So when someone has maybe said something hurtful, or, something's been misunderstood and you are feeling hurt, that's really difficult to lead well when you're feeling vulnerable or when you're feeling pain. So we're going to talk about what you can do when you find yourself in that situation. So the first thing that we think is a good idea is to determine whether you need to address the person that hurt you or not. Um, this can be um, kind of a difficult line to ride, whether to actually confront the person or talk to the person or not. And so in episode 16 with Carrie Sharp, she gave us 6 tips on how to deal with conflict. And so I would refer you back to that episode where she talks about that in more depth. And that will really give you a good guideline as to whether or not you should talk to the person who has hurt you, or whether you just need to sort of deal with it with God. One of the things that she did say was to pray and ask God about about this, whether or not it should be addressed or not. And so I would encourage you to take a listen to what she has to say and how she can help you sort of sift that through that with God.
Yeah, yeah, that was a really helpful episode, and I know that it's helped me just in thinking about other situations that I've had when I've been hurt. So, another thing that you can do in this situation is just to give yourself time to process and heal. Because honestly, when you are hurt by someone else, it just can take time to deal with it. It
Yeah.
unfortunately, it doesn't always just resolve, even if you address it, and even if you do some of these other things we're going to talk about. There's there's times that it just does take time to come to a place of healing. So allow yourself time to process it. One of the ways that I have found super helpful to process when I've been hurt is through writing. And I just find that journaling and writing things down when I've been hurt allows me to get all my feelings out onto paper, and it just frees up space in my mind. And it's also a way for me to pray. I really use it as a form of communicating with God. I kind of look at it as writing to God, even though He already knows how I'm feeling. It allows me to get those thoughts out. And we actually talked about this in the last episode with Gayla Grace. She talked about the power of writing things down during difficult times and how you're able to actually look back later and see how God has worked. And I
Yeah.
know that has been absolutely true in my own life, that I have journals and I can look back and read some of the ways that God has actually, or I'm able to read some of the times where I was really hurting and then see how God worked and how God brought me out of that situation. Have you experienced that, Holly,
So
yourself?
so I'm not a writer, to be
Okay.
honest with you. I like to talk things out. And so oftentimes I talk things out with my husband. Um, so I should probably learn to do this because then I would be able to look back and it would give me a really good um sort of record about how God has been faithful to me. But I think that one thing that I really like about the taking time and whatever way that you choose to process and heal, if you give yourself time, then you're not being reactionary and you're not
Yes.
causing further harm, um, or saying things maybe that you shouldn't. So if you really allow yourself to take the time and just work through some of that stuff without actually escalating the problem. I think that's
Yeah.
really important. So whether it's writing or talking or, just being quiet and sitting and thinking, whatever that is to give yourself time, I think is
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. And
So,
I think that that's really the power of the writing for me, has been to allow myself not to be reactionary, like you said, because I
yeah,
can get all the truth, all the anger, all the feelings out in
yeah,
writing and then not have to say that to the person, which
yeah.
is usually not a good idea to say it to the person.
Probably
So,
really important to do that.
but I think too, I know that I have a lot of friends who don't really love journaling or writing. And I think that even just maybe having something where you just even jot down one or two lines about like this situation, because I do think
Yeah,
it's really powerful. It's like keeping record of how God has worked in your life, is really powerful. So
yeah,
the
definitely.
other thing that you can do with the writing, and again, Gayla mentioned this in our episode, is that you can notice if there are patterns when it comes
Mhm.
to dealing with interpersonal relationships. So
Yeah,
you start to, if you do write, or even if you have a safe person like you mentioned, Holly, talking to your husband, maybe you can ask him or the person that you share with and you talk it out with, are you seeing any kind of pattern
right.
in these types of situations?
Mhm.
Because if you are, there might be something you need to do about it.
Yeah,
So,
so important. And I think that just honestly leads so well into the next thought, which is about self awareness. So if you are on that sort of journey to figure out your motives and figure out your fears and that sort of thing to really understand yourself, how you feel about the world and how you interact with others, I think that that sort of lends you to looking at every situation through that lens and really looking at how you can grow through those things. In episode 17, we talked with Beth McCord, and she talked about self awareness and how to use the Enneagram as a tool to help you in your relationships. And one of the ways that it can be helpful is when you're in a situation where you've been hurt, is to reflect on how you react to that hurt. So, what's your immediate response? What is your immediate sort of gut reaction? What's your first defense? And that can give you a lot of clues to what's really going on inside your heart. Is it hurting your pride? Do you feel taken advantage of? You know, those sorts of things to really understand your motives and maybe really root out some sort of strongholds in your heart that may be causing a lot of that hurt.
Yeah.
And when you look at it that way, when you know, okay, when someone speaks like this or talks about the specific topic, I sort of really get kind of worked up. It helps you kind of understand that maybe the person wasn't looking to hurt you and maybe it wasn't a miscommunication. So I think
Mhm.
those are really important things to examine about yourself.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember. And I think one of the things that Beth mentioned in that episode was the fact that the transformation comes through Christ, and by bringing these hurts to him, you're able to experience healing.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
noticing, like you said, noticing what the motivation is for how you're reacting. And I know for me, just even real recently, I was able to recognize a pattern in the way that I was reacting to certain situations. And when I thought back on my childhood, I realized
Mm.
why I was having those reactions. And it
Ah,
was very much related to a situation that happened in my childhood. And then I was like, oh, this is making more sense as to why that particular situation is hurting me so much. And it made it
definitely.
easier to deal with, even though the situation is still hard.
Right. Oh,
So,
yeah.
yeah. And I have an example of this too. I had a situation a while back that I actually received a Facebook message from someone that was somewhat hurtful. And, that's the thing that is difficult sometimes about social media is it makes it super easy for people to say things that they would never say in real life.
Oh,
But
definitely.
this happened and it was from somebody that I cared about. And unfortunately, he felt fine with saying some of these things that again, I don't know that he would have said to me in person. And my immediate reaction was anger. I got super
Mhm.
angry. I
Yeah.
wanted to reply right away with all the things, all the reasons he was wrong and the reasons that he had no right to say what he did. But thankfully, I took some time to calm down and reflect. And then my anger changed to sadness. And I realized that I was grieving a relationship that had changed and that things were not going to be the same in the future. And it was a hurtful experience, but it gave me a chance to practice that self awareness. And again, to think about why I was becoming angry. And then I was better able to deal with my emotions and with the situation.
Mm.
So, that self-awareness is so key when you're
So
when you're hurt.
important. Yeah.
Yep. So,
That's so hard. I'm sorry you went through that, but I'm glad that you were able to kind of switch from anger to understanding that you were grieving and
yeah,
allowing yourself to go through that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's really helpful when you do take that time to process that, which is not always easy to do. But, the last thing that I wanna mention on this point, I think, is just to remember that ultimately turning to God, through prayer and scripture is gonna be your most beneficial thing to do when you are hurt. Because as we talked about in episode 15, there is no human relationship that can fully fulfill you, or that's always going to be there for
Right.
you. Even if you're married, even if you have really close relationships with family members, those people can still let you down, but God can be there as your constant support and you can rely on him. So there's a passage that I really love in Psalms, and I was actually just reading it this morning, so I thought I would share a section of it. It's Psalm 62, 3-8. And the reason that I love this is that David is, someone who is a leader, someone who has a lot of people that are not always happy with him. um, Even someone who he used to be close to who is coming after him. And so I'm not sure exactly if this psalm is talking about Saul in particular, but I'm just going to read it and I think you'll understand kind of what we're saying here. So it says, "How long will all of you attack a man to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." And I just love this because I feel like when you are hurting, it's helpful to go to scripture and see other people who have been in very similar circumstances. And the things that I love about this passage is, one, the fact that he talks about that people are blessing with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. And I
Mm,
think as leaders,
yeah.
we experience that. Sometimes they outwardly curse too. Not necessarily cursing, but like saying negative things about us, and we experience criticism. But a lot of times people are nice to our faces, but then behind our backs are not, right? So I think that's
Oh,
kind of what he's
definitely.
talking about here.
Yeah.
And then he talks about waiting in silence. And again, I think this goes back to that earlier point of taking time to process and heal, and the need for us to sometimes just be silent,
Mm.
which I was telling Holly earlier, it's not my forte. I'm not that good with waiting. I like to
Yeah.
just do things.
Hmm.
So, how about you, Holly? How does the scripture speak to you?
Yeah, so when we were talking about it before, I told Esther that oftentimes, I wait with my mouth wide open rather than in silence. Um, and actually, I love it that she brought this, psalm up. This happens to be my favorite psalm. And the last verse that she read is my favorite verse in the whole psalm. Trust in him at all times, O people, pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. And I think for me personally, um, the part where it talks about pouring your heart out before God, I tend to hold a lot in, and sometimes I'm not even totally honest with God, and I hold back. I only give him a piece of it. And so part of the reason I love that is because when you're pouring your heart out to him, he's a refuge for you. And if you think about what a refuge is, it's a safe place. When I think about a refuge, I think about someplace that's highly fortified, that's super safe, and where you can just kind of be in there and do whatever you need to do. And so when you think about God being a refuge, it I don't know, it just stills my heart, and it reminds me that he really wants to hear all of those things. And um, when someone's hurt me, he wants me to bring it to him. So
Yeah.
yeah, I just love this scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that ultimately this little piece of advice that we're giving, I think is the one that we want you guys to hold on to the most,
Yeah.
because it's going to apply to all the scenarios that we talk about.
Yeah.
That really God is the one that we can go to with all of this stuff, and
Mhm.
that he does want us to pour out our hurts and our heart to him.
Yeah.
And so often I think our natural reaction is to call up a friend or to go blab about it to so and so, but maybe we should be taking that time to process and go to God first when we're hurt, rather than going to all the other people in our life.
Yeah. And he wants to, he wants to heal us. He wants to heal those spots in us that are reactionary, that, are defensive. And so when you pour out your hurt to him, he can show you those patterns, and he can help heal you from those destructive patterns that might be hurting your relationships. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next topic, which is how to lead when your marriage is hard. And we talked about marriage with our husbands in episode 18, and we shared some of our stories and experiences as couples who lead together. But we didn't talk about when marriage is really hard and how to continue leading well, and continue being multi-passionate and doing all the things that you need to do when that core relationship is sort of in turmoil or in a bad situation, just in a bad place. So we're going to go into that in a little bit more depth and help you with that.
Yeah, yeah. And so we're probably not going to be able to cover obviously all the things
Right, right,
related
right,
to what to
right.
do when marriage is hard in this episode, but
Yes.
there are several blog posts that I have written because before I started the podcast, I had been writing on my blog for a few years, and I have several blog posts about marriage. And in some of them, I share about some of the difficult times that my husband and I have experienced, and we alluded to it in episode 18 when we were talking all together. But there was a period of our marriage, and as my husband was a pastor, that was really hard, and where I did feel very lonely, and I wasn't sure if we were going to make it. And when you're in that situation, it is really hard to lead well. Like you said, Holly, it's hard to lead when your marriage is hard. It's hard to live when your marriage is hard. I mean, it's everything can be skewed by that relationship because that's really your most important human relationship
Yeah.
if you are married. So I'm going to put the links to some of those blog posts in the show notes. So if anybody wants to go check those out and read some of that, go ahead. And some of what we'll share in this conversation is pulled from some of those posts. But again, you'll probably find some additional things in those posts that might be helpful. So here's a few ideas for you when marriage is hard. The first thing I want to say is you need to take care of yourself. Because as Holly and I mentioned in episode 15, you cannot change your spouse. It's
Yeah.
one of the most frustrating parts of life, but you just
Yep.
cannot change another
Yeah.
person, right? You can only control or change yourself. That's really the only thing that you have control over is how you interact, how you behave. So
Yes.
here's a few ways that you can take care of yourself. We're going to give you just a few examples and ways that you can do this. So the first way I think that you can take care of yourself is by taking care of your physical wellness, your physical health. You need to keep your body healthy, especially when you're dealing with a lot of stress. And if your marriage is difficult, you're under stress, it's easy for you to kind of slack on taking care of yourself. And
Yeah.
that includes your physical body, right? So I
Definitely.
know for me, when I have been in extra stressful times, I have tended to not do the things that I know I need to do for my body. Even
Mm.
just some of the regular routines that I've had in the past where I would be really, really consistent with my nightly routine of like washing my face and, all those the things that just made me kind of feel good. Sometimes I would just kind of slack on that. And
Yeah.
over time, that can have a negative effect. So I'm not saying that you need to be out there exercising 7 days a week and doing, the whole 30 diet all the time and all of that. But like, just think about what are some things that you can do to take care of your physical body and see how that impacts your overall stress level. I think
Mm.
it can have a positive impact when you are taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
So also taking care of your spiritual health. So obviously we kind of have already talked about this, but staying connected to God through your spiritual disciplines, staying involved in a church community and a small group if possible, these things
Mm.
are going to help sustain you when your marriage is hard.
Yeah.
Um, because having those other people and that support system in place and your relationship with God staying healthy will be kind of a lifeline for you
Yeah.
when things are not going well, right?
Mm.
Another thing is taking care of your mental and emotional health. So, what are some things that you can do that do bring you joy, that you do love doing? And again, I find a lot of women make excuses for not doing these things,
Mm.
for not taking time to do something that you like or that you enjoy.
Yeah.
Um, but I believe that we can if we simply make it a priority.
Yeah,
So it might be that you need to go see a therapist. If your mental health is really suffering during this difficult time in your marriage, it's okay to go get help.
absolutely.
Um, and it might be that you just need to do something fun, like I said, like go take an art class, or, take time for the writing that you want to do, or any number of other things that might just give you that extra filling up of your cup that will help you to have energy to deal with the difficult circumstances that you're in.
Yeah,
So,
so important. Um, I think that you're absolutely right. Women tend to push this to the back burner. They find that, uh, or I find that most often women will take care of everything else, all 99,000 things that need to happen, rather than taking even just 5 minutes to go outside for a walk in nature that may boost your mental and emotional health and give you the strength to get through the day. So, so important. And the last thing is to take care of your relational wellness. So, obviously, if your marriage is struggling, then you're likely wanting to make things better there. But what about your other relationships? So, really, we're talking about not isolating yourself and maintaining your friendships or relationships with family members. And sometimes these relationships are the ones that can get us through difficult times. Really, it's about finding your tribe. I think Zach mentions that in episode 18. And in fact, that was really important for me for quite a while. I don't know that we were necessarily struggling, but I don't know that we were doing super well. And finding that tribe that really encouraged me and prayed for me and um, encouraged me towards doing better with him really helped. I think that those are the people that, if you're doing it well, can really point you back to reconciliation and unity with your husband. Um, Finding even that one person maybe that you can talk to about what's going on, and then you know, having that person hold you accountable on your mindset, having that person talk to you about what you're doing to take care of your physical wellness. I mean, that person can really help you through. And honestly, the other thing about it that seems just kind of a small thing, but seemed really big for me is whenever I've been having a really hard time and I'm with those people in a group setting and we're able to just laugh together and enjoy each other's company, it kind of lifts the heaviness for a minute and lets you take a deep breath and maybe gain some perspective or gain some strength to move on if you're in a really difficult time that feels super weighty. So having even just a girls' night to go out and have dinner together and just laugh about silly things honestly can do wonders for your relational wellness and remind you that relationships can be really fun and can bring you life. So,
yeah, yeah. It's been so helpful for me in the same way. I think during the time that things were really hard in my marriage, I had two friends that at the time were a little bit further ahead in life than I was. And they were both married, and I was able to confide in them. And I think this is something that what you're saying, Holly, is it's really about boundaries and knowing who your safe people are
yeah,
because you don't necessarily need to share this difficulty with everybody that you meet, and you really shouldn't.
yep,
You shouldn't even necessarily share it with your entire small group or a whole group of people, but maybe you have a couple people that you know are trustworthy that you can share, and not to speak negatively of your husband, but to just be honest about the situation.
yeah,
And I know for me that those two friends that I had during that time were invaluable. I honestly don't know how I would have gotten through it without having that resource of
yeah.
those friendships. The last thing really that we want to talk about in terms of marriage is that you actually can control your own attitude and your own mindset. And again, this is hard,
How?
right, Holly? It's not something that's really easy, and we don't necessarily love talking about it because the responsibility comes back on us, and we might
Yeah,
be thinking that the situation is not our fault or that our husband is doing something wrong,
Mhm.
which sometimes is the case, but we still have the ability to control our mindset. So, the ways that I've been able to do this is one, to look for ways to appreciate my husband. And when I can find one little thing to appreciate about my husband, I can change my emotions really by taking that minute to verbally say what I appreciate about him or to write it down. Then
Mhm.
that changes my emotions, right?
Yeah.
And it's actually scientifically proven that our mind, our thoughts can control our emotions. So the things that we think will then precede our emotions.
Mm.
So maybe you need to reframe your thoughts about your husband, and can you take a minute to think about something positive about him? And just one other little trick that I've used in the past is in the moment, sometimes you might not think of anything positive in the current situation.
Right.
And so it might require you thinking back to when things were really good in your relationship, when you first met, reminiscing about something fun that you did together. And just bringing back that positive memory can
Mhm.
actually put you in a better frame of mind.
Yeah.
So, any other thoughts?
That's a really good tip. Uh,
Sometimes we have to use these tricks to like get ourselves into a better place because I don't know about you, but I find if I start thinking negatively about my husband, then I start feeling negative all the time and it turns into a really negative cycle
oh, yeah.
because you just are down, you just keep spiraling down, down, down.
Mhm. I find that I don't know that I'm doing it until I feel like it's too late. I know it's not actually too late, but I've gone way down that spiral and I'm just not in a good headspace over it. So, I would love to learn to catch myself a lot sooner.
Yeah.
Because I'm really bad at that. Yeah.
And I
So,
think, like you said before, I think sometimes it might be having that person that is maybe an accountability partner or maybe a mentor
yeah.
that you can go to and that you have given them permission to
Mm,
say to you,
yeah.
"Listen, Holly, um, I totally empathize with how you're feeling. It's really hard, but can you think of something positive?" Like maybe they
Yeah.
are the ones that you're asking them to help you come out of that.
Right.
And
Right.
again, that takes a lot of vulnerability to say to someone like, "I give you permission to say that to me when I need to hear it." So,
Yeah. And honestly, I think for me, if that outside person kind of called me on the carpet, if you will, I think I would see it a little bit better than if my husband was like, "Hey, you are doing this," or "Why are you always so negative towards me?" You know
yeah.
what I mean? So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last thing we're going to discuss is when you disagree with leadership over you. And this one is hard. Um, I think the marriage one is hard. I think they're all hard, but for some
Yeah.
reason, I feel like this one is a tough one.
Yeah, we're gonna tread lightly on this one.
Yeah, we are. So the first thing that I want to remind you when you disagree with leadership is to understand that maybe you don't have the whole picture of what's going on. Sometimes those in leadership are given information that they can't share with everyone. And sometimes the decisions they make are based on some of that knowledge. And so we need to trust them enough to handle the information and make decisions based off that. So that can be a really difficult thing to remember because in the sort of information age where everything is outed and everything is investigated, it's hard to remember that sometimes you just don't need the information that they have. And if you're in a position where you've subjected yourself to their authority, you should have already made the decision that they are trustworthy with that. They're trustworthy with that authority and that they are, their heart is directed towards God. And so you need to be able to trust them to handle that information and make the best decisions based on that. And sometimes it's going to be with things that you don't agree with. Um, and the second side of that is to pray that when you're in that position, that you will do what God calls you to do. Because if you're in a position of leadership, even if maybe you're not the head honcho, you're in that ladder somewhere, the same situation may happen to you, where you have a piece of information that your team doesn't and need to make decisions based on that. So,
Yeah.
um, the next thing that you can do when you're in this situation is to speak love over the person or to other people about them. We all know that leadership can be hard. And when you have a person who's super negative and is displaying that outwardly towards other people, or you just know is not happy, that can really be detrimental to a leader. And so when you're sort of in this hierarchy and you yourself are a leader, but you're also under leadership, it's really important to not bash those that are over you. It's really important to still be supportive and to still speak about them positively to the greater organization or the greater community or whatnot. Because really the goal in this is reconciliation. The goal is not to tear them down. And if you're having that sort of reaction that all you want to do is tear them down, then you really need to be checking yourself, and maybe just be silent.
Yep. Yeah.
um, so other leaders, other people who are on a leadership team, it's really important that we hold each other up and we encourage them even when we disagree with them.
Yes.
We're all super different and we all have different motives. And, as we've talked about this, we're all wired differently. And so, how things come across, maybe their personality, their way of saying it, you might disagree with, but in the end, your goal is towards the same mission and the same, um, the same.
Ultimate purpose.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I feel like this aligns perfectly with the marriage thing that we talked about earlier.
Mm,
Like, the worst thing that you can do for your marriage is to speak negatively about your spouse in front of other people. And I think the worst thing that you can do in a leadership situation, in ministry, in any kind of team situation, is to speak negatively about the leader
yeah,
to your other team members.
yeah.
That nothing will destroy the organization faster than that. And so I think that you really need to figure out if the situation and if what you disagree with your leader about is worth addressing or not. So you need to wrestle through and pray about if you do need to bring it to the leader, but definitely don't bring it to other people.
Yeah.
Bring it only to the person that you're having the issue with. And so, a couple thoughts, and again, this goes back to episode 16 with Carrie Sharp. She talked about some of this, but using I statements instead of you statements. When, if you decide, okay, I disagree with my leader about X, Y, or Z, I want to bring it to him or her. When you go in using I statements instead of you statements, so you're not
Mhm.
blaming. I mean, that's a very basic communication technique, but
Yeah.
it's something that I think we still need reminding
Yeah.
sometimes, because it's easy to go into blaming and to think about the way that that person is doing something that you disagree with, so you're blaming them. And then another tip that I've heard, and I can't remember where I heard it, but it's the idea of focusing on the mission of the organization rather than on the person. So if you can come to an agreement that you both care about the mission or the organization, the team, the church, the business, whatever it is that you're in, then you start at the common ground and then you work backwards from there on, okay, now we see a different approach to reach that goal,
Yeah.
but at least you're in agreement on the ultimate purpose or the ultimate goal, like we mentioned.
Mm. Yeah.
And there's a couple of resources that I just want to mention that I have either heard of or used myself, that might help if you need to bring a situation to a leader that you disagree with. One book that I've heard great reviews of, it's on my reading list, but I haven't read it yet, is How to Lead When You're Not in Charge by Clay Scroggins. And we'll put the link to that in the show notes if you want to check that out. I know it's available on Amazon and I think it's on Audible as well. And then Radical Candor by Kim Scott is another great book. I have read that one, really love it. It's not a faith based book, there is some language in it. So just giving you that warning, but it is really, really a solid book about dealing with specifically when you're the boss, but she also addresses situations when you're not the boss, when you're in situations with team members or leadership over you. There's also a podcast which is not currently running, but I think there's 20 some episodes. There are some specific episodes about how to approach a boss or how to approach a team member about something you disagree with them about. So those are some great resources for you if you are dealing with a situation when you're not necessarily in agreement with the leadership. So,
Yeah.
Holly, do you have any thoughts or examples of how you've dealt with this?
I do have an example, but I want to circle back really quick to something I was just thinking about. When you're figuring out whether or not something is worth addressing, I think it's important to remember that when you are kind of at the tip top, or when someone is sort of at the tip top of an organization, they're hearing a lot of negative things. And people, just because you have the foresight to figure out whether or not it's worth addressing, not everyone does. And so, you know, it's one of those like same old stories. Do you really need to address whether or not you like the color of the carpet? It's one of those things just to remind you that these people are dealing with a lot of people that feel that their opinion needs to be heard. And so they may be getting all kinds of feedback from people, positively and negatively. And that can be really wearing on someone's spirit and someone's mental health, spiritual health, all of those things. So I would just really caution you to take the time that it is worth it to take the time to figure out whether or not it's worth addressing.
Yes.
um,
Mhm.
because the last thing we want to do is erode these people even more, because leadership, as we know, is very difficult. So
Right. Yeah, I 100% agree. So do you want to share
oh
your
yes,
example?
yes, so I do have an example of this. I at one point was in charge of a project, and we were sort of at the beginning stages of getting this project going. And I was aware of another situation in the organization, another decision that was being made. And I really felt like it would cause an issue if I went through the project to the very end and then this decision was made and this decision was revealed. Um, I felt like it would um, pull into question my integrity and how I was handling the project, how I was portraying the project, all of those things to the greater public, when I, in fact, knew about this other decision that wasn't going to be, or that could potentially be revealed at the end of the project. And so I was very concerned with how that would portray me and my integrity. And I thought about it for a while. I talked to my husband about it. I prayed about it and I was like, you know what? I can't let this go. I have to talk about it because it's affecting how I am working through this project. It's affecting everything I'm thinking about, and I can't let it go. So I was able to sit down and talk to the leader, and it took a while for us to see each other's sides. It took a while for that leader to understand where I was coming from. And it took a while for me to understand his mindset as well. And when we finally came down to it, I was able to convey to this person that he had been in this other decision making process for a super long time. And in his mind, it was top of mind. But to the general population, it was not even at all top of mind. And
Right.
so to them, it might catch them off guard and color this certain project that I was doing. And so it was a really great conversation to have and to finally come to a decision on how we were going to handle it. And he could understand that I was willing to put myself up there and be the sort of pusher of this project, the real driver in this case, but I didn't want I didn't want it to have negative repercussions in the end, and I didn't want it to sour people's thoughts about, the project. So,
Right.
I know that's really vague. Um,
Trying to protect
I
all
know.
parties involved.
I am, but, I think it's important to for me anyway, because I've always had a really hard time with confrontation.
Mhm.
um, it's really good for me to look back and go, I did everything I was supposed to do. I prayed about it. I talked with my husband about it. I tried to work through it before I even brought it to him, and when I brought it to him, we had a long conversation where we worked together to understand each other's sides, and
Yeah.
we came to a compromise where I felt comfortable and he felt comfortable with how we were going to move forward. And I'm really glad that I took that route, because it could have easily turned into, well, I can't believe he's still continuing with, this other decision making
Mhm.
process when I'm clearly doing X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
it, it, it,
It
and
could
that
have gone really differently.
it helps no one. It helps no one to do
Yeah.
that. So it can happen. It can be done.
Yeah.
Um, but
It's not easy, and so I
no,
think what we need to just remember here when we're dealing with the situations where we are needing to address a leader is that it's not easy for us and it's also not easy for them. And the thing that you did in that situation that I love is that you went in seeking to understand.
yeah,
Your purpose of that conversation was to understand where he was coming from so that you were better able to figure out how to move forward.
yeah.
And instead of going in with your own agenda and saying, this is what I think needs to happen and you
Mhm.
have no right to do blah, 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 so it's
Yeah.
really, um, we just want to encourage you that it can be done. And again, maybe go back to some of the episodes we've talked about with how different personalities affect
Yeah.
interacting and communicating, because that's another big thing. And we did talk about that too with episode 17 with Beth about the Enneagram is understanding your personality and how
Mhm.
you might interact in different stressful situations can be helpful. But yeah, I think that, we've talked about these different situations. We've talked about what to do when you've been hurt. We've talked about how to deal with things when marriage is really hard, and also about how to approach things or how to deal with relationships when you disagree with the leadership.
Mhm.
And our hope with this episode is that you've gained something that can encourage you and that can give you hope, and to know that things will get better. Things can get better.
Yeah.
And it's not always just a cut and dry, simple formula of do
No.
this and this is going to happen, right? Because it's people and it's messy. And,
I
we
wish.
both, yeah, it would be so much easier. I have
It
long
would.
wanted just a formula of
Mhm.
a plus B equals C,
Yeah.
and everything is better. But that's not
No.
how life works. So, but we both had situations when things have felt really difficult. And, we just want to mention that we do have our Facebook group. If you are a leader and if you're dealing with difficult relationships, you know, that's part of why we have that Facebook group available, is so that we can support one another. Not so that we can go in there and rail against somebody else or spill all of our personal problems, but
Right.
if you have a situation that maybe you could use some wisdom or some guidance on or some prayer for, we would love to support you. So
Yeah.
just head over to estherlittlefield.com/group if you want to join us in there. And also, we just want to mention that, again, there may be times where you need to seek out professional support around relationships.
Yeah.
And these things that we've talked about are in no way meant to replace that.
Mhm.
There's no shame in reaching out for support when you need it. And sometimes the support might look like a friendship, and sometimes it might look like you need to go see a therapist. So,
Yeah.
or you might need to talk to your doctor if you're having health problems or other things like that. So,
Yeah.
don't hesitate to do that. So, we are going to wrap up the episode, and we, of course, are going to end with a fun question like we usually do. So, Holly, you want to get us started on this?
Yes. So, Esther, if you were to get a tattoo, what would it say or what would the graphic be?
Okay, so I've thought about this a little bit. I have no tattoos. I don't know if I ever will. I'm just not super into tattoos, but I kind of, if I were to get a tattoo, I've thought about two different ideas that I like. And one of them is somebody that I saw one time. I was actually in Guatemala again. I keep coming back to Guatemala
Yeah.
because I love it and I've been there several times. But a gal that we were on a mission trip with had a tattoo on her foot and it had the shape of Guatemala and a heart inside of it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it was just really simple and cute. And I liked it because I just liked the way it was on her foot. It wasn't in a super obvious place,
Mhm.
something that people would see all the time, but it was basic. The other thing that I've thought about if I were to get one is actually to do a Hebrew word.
Oh, yeah.
And the Hebrew word would be the word for trust that's used in the Bible. And I think it's pronounced batak. I'm probably saying that wrong, but anyway, it's spelled batak. And yeah, it means trust. And it's used a ton in the Psalms. And I've been doing some study around that word. And I just love it because it reminds me of the fact that I am not in control and that I can trust God. And
Yeah.
so it's a continual process for me to let go of control and to trust God. And so that would be a good reminder for me.
Yeah.
So, how about you?
Okay, so I do have a tattoo. It's on my foot, and it's an anchor with the word hope underneath of it. And it is reference to the verse in Hebrews that talks about how we have this hope as an anchor for our soul, steadfast and firm that enters into the veil. And it is, it's a reminder to me that when I was going through all of the pain and difficulty with infertility, that no matter what struggle I have in life, my um, my salvation and my relationship with God supersedes all of that, and that's my hope, and that's the anchor for my soul. And so, I love that tattoo, but I want more. A word to the wise: if you ever get a tattoo, they can be addicting.
Yes, I have heard that, and that's
Yeah,
probably why I don't wanna get one because I don't
yeah,
wanna become like a tattooed covered
yeah.
person. It's just not my style.
Um, no, I can't imagine you tattooed covered. That just doesn't go with your personality. Um, but the one I want next, which, my husband does not like tattoos, so the fact that I even got one is kind of funny.
Yeah.
But the next one I want is a feather, which is really strange because I'm terrified of birds.
Right.
I don't like
Yeah.
birds at all, but I love the verse where it talks about God hiding us under his wing.
Mhm.
And so even though it is related to birds, I just love that picture of him covering us and him protecting us and just
Mm,
being in that sort of safe place. So
yeah.
if you have another idea of what I could get instead of a feather, let me know.
You could just go full on with the bird and a bird's nest.
I could I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. But I've been forbade, whatever the word
Oh.
is,
Mm. Yes.
from getting any more, but I don't know. It
We'll
might happen
see.
anyway.
Side note, when Holly and I were in a Bible study together several years ago,
Mhm.
there was like the beginning of our Bible study where we would meet every Tuesday night and we would end up staying into like 10:30, sometimes 11 o'clock.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes Zach would be like texting me saying, "Where is Holly?" And we would reply and say, "Oh, we just took her to get a tattoo." So anyway, that's probably not the best marriage advice, but
Taunting your friend's husband.
right. Oh, goodness. Okay, well, we need to wrap up. So
Okay.
we just want to thank everybody for joining us for this episode. Again, if you have thoughts or feedback, we love having the conversation in our Facebook group. So
Yep.
come on over and join us there, and we can talk more about how we deal with things when relationships are hard. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.